Good evening, good evening. So much to learn, so little time. We are in the middle of chapter 7 of the second part of Shaar HaYichud the second part of the Gate of Unity of Faith, where the Alter Rebbe is in the middle of teaching us that not only does the world not exist, it's also not important, which are apparently two separate points that you have to understand. Not only that it doesn't exist, which is one thing, but also that even when it doesn't exist, it's also not important. What does that mean?
To say it doesn't exist, but it exists.
No. Well, that's also true, right? That's the way in which it exists. The way in which it exists is that it's important. What do we mean? So let's talk about what we spoke about last week, right? We have God's desire for kingship. God's desire for kingship. His malchus, his desire to be king, his trait of kingship. And that is what creates the world as something that is apart from him. Right? That's why he conceals himself from his creation, so that the world perceives itself to be an independent reality. Because only an independent reality, only an Am can satisfy his relationship to be Melech. Only an Am, only a nation, only something that is separate from him is able to truly worship him, is able to truly inaugurate him king and make him king. So it is because of his trait of kingship that he creates the world, at least the world as we perceive it, the world as it is, separate and independent from God. This is due to his trait of kingship. We also explained that his kingship, his trait of desiring to be king and ruling over the world as a king, is also connected to speech, to the divine speech, as we explained. That the part of the body, that malchus, that kingship, the svira, the divine trait of kingship is associated with is the mouth, right? Is speech. What is the connection between speech and kingship? Very simply, that both of these are things that demand the other. They demand another person, an existence other than myself. If there's no existence other than myself, I cannot express my kingship. And if there is no existence other than myself, I do not need to speak. To whom am I speaking if nothing other than me exists? Therefore, God has a trait, whether you want to call it kingship, as we've called it in this chapter, or you want to call it the divine speech, as we've been calling it in the previous 6 chapters, right? The divine capacity to speak, the mouth, the divine mouth, so to speak. Either way, whichever way you call it, this is the divine trait that needs a world to exist, that makes the world important. Why does it make the world important? Because in order for this trait to be fulfilled, whether you think of it as speech or whether you think of it as kingship, in order for this trait to be fulfilled, there must be something other than him. There must be a universe in the sense that we perceive it. There must be a separate reality from God. And we went further last week. We explained that this is not the case just when he creates the world. In other words, this is not true that the world is important, that the universe fulfills a divine need. This is not just true when he creates the universe. This is not just true when he is actually speaking the universe into existence, as we've spent 6 chapters explaining that the universe is nothing other than the divine speech, right? Not only when he speaks is the universe important. The universe is important in his capacity to speak. Or to put it in terms of kingship, which again refers to the same divine trait, malchus. And to put it in terms of kingship, it's not just when he actually has a nation that there is something which is important, that he needs a nation. His need for a nation is inherent to his trait of kingship. In other words, it is not actually speaking or actually being a king that lends importance to the universe. It is his capacity to speak and his capacity to be a king, or his desire to be a king, which makes the universe important. In other words, the existence of the universe, and when I say existence, I mean in the most basic sense, the fact that the universe is important, the fact that there needs to be something called a universe, right? There needs to be something other than God, is implicit in these divine traits, or so it would seem, right? The very fact that he has a divine trait called Malchus, a 10th Sphira, as we explained last week, a 10th divine mode of expression, which is only fulfilled in the other, which is directed toward something other than God himself, unlike all of the other 9 divine traits, which are all, what's the term? Self-contained. Right? Even the divine kindness, we said, is like a kind person here on earth, where the kindness is really something that they have. The other only provides a means by which it can be expressed. Right? The other only provides a means. I'm a kind person, so if I have a dog, I'll be kind to a dog. If I have a family, I'll be kind to a family, right? It's a kindness that doesn't make a difference. Kindness is not defined by the person receiving the kindness. Kindness is an inherent trait. It's something I have. And if someone else is here to receive it, then okay, someone else is here to receive it. But it's not defined by the other person being here. As opposed to this last sphira, the only one of the 10, kingship, Malchus, is defined by the receiver. It's defined by the other, right? The other has to be a certain way. They can't be my son. They have to be a nation, right? Or to put it in the terms of speech, it can't be anything that is created from the words or. It must be light which is created from the word or, right? When God speaks it into existence. In other words, the other, what is created, what is ruled over, what is spoken, is important and has relevance to this divine trait, to the trait of Malchus. Therefore, even before the universe is created, even with just the divine traits, just his ability to speak, even the ability to speak the divine speech, or his trait of kingship, his trait of Malchus, to rule over the universe, this divine trait itself would seem to contradict the principle of divine unity, that there is nothing other than him, right? Or as I put it last week, the principle we have been using as our explanation for the first 6 chapters, which is the world does not contradict God's unity because all it is the divine speech, that very principle, the divine speech, our solution for the first 6 chapters, is now our problem. The divine speech is a problem because even if the universe is nothing other than the divine speech is itself seemingly a contradiction to God's unity. The divine speech is directed towards the other. It needs something other than him. And not just the speech itself, but even his ability to speak, the divine mouth, the trait of Malchus. Therefore, we have a 7th chapter of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. We have a 7th chapter of this book where the Alter Rebbe goes on to explain not just the unity of the world with God's speech. Really, that's just as we said last week, really that's just a hakdama. That's really just a preface. The first 6 chapters are really just to get us to the point where we understand that nothing in the universe has any existence beyond the divine speech. Chapter 7 is really about, and as we're getting into chapter 7, this is what we're going to speak about, is what is the nature of this divine speech? How is this divine speech not a contradiction to God's unity, that there is nothing other than God? Because it would seem that he has a trait which demands that there be something other than him. This is the contradiction, so to speak, or the tension which we are coming in our chapter to explain. And there are 2 answers to this question. There are 2 answers to why his kingship or his speech do not contradict his unity. The first answer is called the higher level unity, and the second answer is called the lower level unity. Because the only way we can solve the problem of this divine trait of kingship is to say that this divine trait itself has no separate identity from the higher levels of godliness, from the other divine traits. In other words, his kingship is itself not real in some way. If his kingship is itself not real in some way, then it no longer poses a problem, because we can say the world is important to his kingship, but what is his kingship? His kingship is itself not important, for example, right? So in other words, we have to move a step up the ladder. We have to move a step up the process. Rather than looking at the world which is created by the divine speech, we have to look at how the divine speech is unified with higher levels of godliness. And there are two ways in which it is unified. There is a higher level unity, which is called in Hebrew Yichuda Allah, Ilah, the higher oneness, unity, which is referred to by the pasuk Shema Yisrael, that we say twice every day. And then there is a lower level unity, which is referred to by the pasuk Baruch Shem, that we say. The higher level unity is where Malchus rises to the level of the higher spheres. It rises to become one with the higher spheres, the higher expressions of godliness, and therefore loses its independent existence. The lower level unity is when the higher levels of godliness come and unify with Malchus. That in the place of Malchus itself, in the place of his kingship itself, it becomes unified with God. As we're going to explain at much greater length. That's what we're going to be speaking about now. So if if that doesn't mean much to you, the difference between the two levels of unity, that is exactly what we are going to go on and discuss next. I think that's pretty much the summary of what we said last week. So let us continue. We're going to do some reading inside, God willing. You have to do that once every couple of weeks, otherwise you lose the class. Page 913 in the English. In the Hebrew, Ulefi Shem Midas. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe. Second line on 913. Ulefi Shem Midas Malchusa Yisbarech Meyuchedes B'Mechusay V'Atzmusay Yisbarech. Since, what is the basic solution to the problem of the divine speech, or the divine kingship? Since the trait of his blessed kingship is united with his very essence and his very being. In other words, since his kingship is itself nothing, just as the world is nothing to his kingship, just as the world is nothing other than the divine speech, so too is the divine speech, or his trait of kingship, nothing to his very essence, to the very essence of godliness, the very essence of a being of godliness. Betachlis HaYichud, it is united with it in an absolute unity with the essence of godliness, Kamesha Yisbar, as we will explain. This is the one-line answer. The one-line answer to the question of how is the divine speech not a contradiction to his unity is that the divine speech is itself united with godliness. It's united with something higher than it. So don't think of the divine speech as an independent reality which determines the nature of anything. In other words, sure, his speech values the universe and says that the universe is important, but who says his speech is important? Itself, right? As we will discuss. Very interesting idea. How this is God himself speaks it. How could it not be important? How could it be nothing? How could it be totally united with him? As we'll discuss at great length, God willing. Says the Alter Rebbe, Kameshi Yisbar, as we will explain. In other words, stay tuned. Hilkach, therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, since his kingship is united with his higher expressions of godliness, Gam bechinas hamakim v'hazman, so too are space and time, betelim b'metzias mamish, absolutely nullified in their very existence. They have no independent existence at all. Lagabe mahusay v'atzmusay yisborich, in comparison to his very essence and being, kebitol hashemesh b'shemesh, like the ray of the sun in the sun, the nullity of the ray of the sun in the sun, right? Referring back to what we said in chapter 3. That the nothingness of the world, that the world is nothing like the ray of the sun within the sun. In other words, we come, because Malchus, because God's kingship is totally united with him, and totally batal, is totally nullified, therefore the world has the exact same unity as we described it before. Right? In other words, you could look at everything we've done since chapter 3, in a sense, as challenging the conception of the world as a ray of the sun in the sun, as being absolute nothingness, and then removing the challenges, answering the questions, right? First we had a question regarding Tzimtzum, right, regarding Shem Elikim, God's divine self-concealment, and then we had a different question, and finally here we have the question of Malchus. We have the question of God's kingship, and we're saying that this question is also not really a contradiction, as the Alter Rebbe will explain. If you understand what God's kingship truly is, you will see that what we said earlier in chapter 3 is correct. What we said earlier in chapter 3 is the correct understanding. The world is absolutely nothing like the ray of the sun in the sun. It has no existence, and it has no importance. There is no need for it. There is no essential importance in comparison to God, as we shall see. V'zehu, I'm going to get my whiteboard in a second. V'zehu shiluv shem adnos b'shem havaya. This is the integration of the name of Adnos in the name of Havaya. And in order to illustrate this, I shall briefly use my whiteboard. I'm very excited.
That's a wafer there.
That's how you know. That's how you know we're getting serious.
Thank you.
It's a whiteboard class.
There will have a wafer. Good for you. You can fit in one. Especially to girls.
Circle them so you can see what's going on here. And here, we'll make that shorter because it's a yud. And here we have, I could have pre-done this at home, but then would you really be experiencing the magic firsthand?
Probably. We're probably going to walk out in the trunk on the way over.
Those are expensive
All
ones.
the better to see you with.
Those are expensive ones, I can tell.
Look smarter.
All right, gentlemen. We have here a Kabbalistic representation. I don't know if it comes through on the video, but a Kabbalistic representation of the higher level unity and the lower level unity. Now, if anyone has ever opened the Kabbalistic Siddur, I don't know who among us would ever do such a thing.
Yeah, don't eat.
You may notice if you open a Kabbalistic Siddur that sometimes when it says the name of God, you may see one of these two things, right? These are both 8-letter names of God. These are both 8-letter names of God. How do the names work? This is called a shiluv, an integration of divine names, which is literally derived by putting two divine names together. So we have two divine names, as we spoke about, I think, 2 weeks ago. You have the name Havaya, the 4-letter name of God, right, which corresponds, as we've spoken about before, to God's kindness, the trait of, to God's, well, let's not confuse things. Let's say here it corresponds to the trait of kindness, and here we have the Shem Adnai, Shem Adnai, which is the another 4-letter name of Hashem, which refers to, as we've said before, his kingship. Adon means master, ruler. Adnai, my master, refers to his trait of kingship, that he is a ruler, he has dominion, he has rulership over the earth. The shiluv, the integration of the two names, can be in two ways, right? You have a higher way and a lower way. The higher and lower is determined by which name comes first. Havaya, as we're going to learn, is the higher name than Adnai. So the higher level unity is where Havaya starts first. You start with the Yud, right? In the lower level unity, you start with the Aleph from Adnai, and the Havaya is the one that is integrated in, right? So you have a starting name, as indicated by the first letter, and then the other name is unified with it, it's integrated in. So Kabbalistically speaking, when he says the shiluv, the integration of the two names, he's going to discuss a higher level unity and a lower level unity, and it's these two names that we're discussing, Kabbalistically speaking. In the Kabbalah, they will teach about how these two names of God come together. So if you want to represent in the names of God the higher level unity, which is again Malchus ascending to the higher spheres, to the higher divine expressions, that's when the Shem Adnai, the Shem that starts with an Aleph, ascends to become integrated in and become one with the higher spheres as represented by Havaya. So you have starts with the Yud and then the Aleph comes in. The opposite, when the higher spheres come lower, right, when Havaya comes into Adnai, so you have here, Adnai is the starting name, starting with an Aleph, and then you have the Shem Havaya as integrated into it. I've circled the name Adnai in both, just so you could see more clearly the two different names. That's why I circled the name Adnai in each. Clear, more or less? I mean, maybe it doesn't, you don't know what it means, but it's clear what is happening, at least, in the names. Just so you have an idea of what he means when he says shiluv, the integration of the names, Kabbalistically speaking. This is what he means. I'll leave this over here to look at.
In that book that you're referring to,
What book?
The Siddur.
the Siddur,
Yeah.
do they spell a word exactly like that? So what is it? Has it got a name then?
No, it's like that.
Pronunciation.
That's how they write it. I don't know how you pronounce it, but that's how they would put it. We may have one in the shul, which Ronnie's going to find for us.
Does it have a name?
I don't know if you pronounce it that way. I doubt it.
No, you don't. You pronounce it.
You pronounce it the same every way, the same way we pronounce it in our davening. It looks differently so that you can contemplate the different Kabbalistic intentions behind the words.
Yep. What are these guys? Siddur?
Yeah, but that's the whole word.
So, we have a shiluv. That's what he means when he says the alternation. Now, I've been translating it as integration, same thing. Zeu shiluv shem adnos b'shem havaya. This unity is when the two names are put together. The names are integrated, right? Remember, the names are each connected to an action of God, which is a divine trait of God, right? There's the trait of kingship, and there's the trait of Havaya, which, as we're going to see, is being beyond kingship, being beyond the world, a name of transcendence. So when the two names come together in these two different ways, right, we have essentially the unity between his kingship and his other traits, which makes his kingship not a contradiction to his unity. That's what we're discussing. Kishem Havaya, continues the Alter Rebbe, page 914. Kishem Havaya, the name of Havaya, the four-letter name of Hashem, Yud and then Hey and then Vav and then Hey, Meiresh Hulamayla Me'azman, indicates that he transcends time, he is above time, Shehu Haya Hove Ve'yiyeh Berega Echad, that he was, is, and will be in one moment. Right? Because if you put the words for was, is, and will be all together, you get Hashem's four-letter name. Right? The base form of the verb is past tense. The vav, the base form is past tense with a yud. You have a present tense with a vav, and then the yud at the beginning is future tense usually, right? Or in
Job itself.
Yeah, in different svarim of the Torah, it's reversed, right? It has to do with Hebrew grammar. But the bottom line is that you can see how this four-letter name of Hashem, it integrates all three tenses. It's all three tenses, grammatically speaking, at once. It's a past tense of the verb is, of the verb to be. It's was, is, and will be, all in one word, all at the same time, is the four-letter name of Hashem.
Which is?
The Yud and
the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, which this four-letter name of Hashem indicates godliness as he is above time. If you'll recall, I actually didn't review it, which was my mistake, pardon me. But if you recall, last week we explained that the world is defined by space and time. Space and time are essential to something being a world. So when we say that Havaya is above the world, we mean it is not only not of the world, but it transcends the world entirely. It is not the source of space and time, it is beyond space and time. As is written in the Zohar. Havaya is also above space, not just above time. Because he is constantly creating time, above and below and in all four directions. In other words, as we see, he is constantly creating space. Did I say time by accident? Mm-hmm. Pardon me. He is constantly creating space. My mistake. I myself am getting losing my space. The two are linked, so it's not the most terrible mistake. So we see in the very name itself that he's above time because it's past, present, and future together. And from the fact that he constantly creates and that space itself is his creation, we see that he is beyond space. Right? Now the thing is that it's a little bit confusing because he says the Shem Havaya, this four-letter name of God, creates space. And yet it is totally above space, right? You have to understand how these two things go together. It creates space. It says he transcends space, for he continually brings into existence the whole dimension of space. He transcends it because he brings it into existence, right? So, in other words, it's not a contradiction, but it is interesting in light of the other name we're talking about, the name of Malchus, the name of Adonai, the other divine name, which is connected with the universe, time, space, dominion over time and space, as we explained last week. Because the truth is that both of them are above time and space, and both of them create time and space, right? Again, both of them are in some sense above time and space, and both of them in some sense create time and space. So here's where you have to get a little more subtle.
It doesn't say they're in space.
No, not in space. It's not within space. Neither of them are within space. These are divine traits we're talking about. These are the traits of God, right? Both of these traits of God are above time and space, and both of them are involved in the creation of time and space, right? So in other words, we have to get more subtle. It's a question not of absolutes, but of emphasis, right? Of emphasis. Havaya, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, referring to God as he's above time and space, it creates time and space. But how does it create it? At a distance. At a distance. In other words, not directly involved. For example, the example we gave last week for Hashem's chesed was the sun doesn't care where its light shines, right? The sun doesn't care if its light falls in a palace or in a garbage dump because the sun just emanates. The sun's position is, I emanate. Where the light goes, the light goes. What's important is that I emanate. Right? That's like kindness. It was the same idea with kindness to a dog or kindness to a family member is the same idea. Right? That I am just kind. Where the kindness lands, how the kindness expresses, what means it will find to express itself is not really important because the important thing to kindness is that I'm kind. So too with Shem Havaya, right? God's infinite kindness is I create. What is created is not important. Right? What is created comes about at a distance. It's like saying that the sun cares whether its light falls in the palace or in a toilet, right? For example, right? That's not the way that the sun emanates. So too with Havaya. Havaya is he creates time and space, but time and space are of no relevance to it. In other words, it just is. It just expresses. Remember, it's not about the other. It's about divine self-expression. It's a trait of the divine self. I create, says God. What I create, okay, there have to be things that I create if I'm going to create. But what they are is of no particular importance, right? I'll create anything and everything. Remember, as we said in chapter 4, the divine trait of Havaya, the divine kindness creates infinitely. It creates everything. Everything that can be, right? Everything that might be. At some level, maybe even things that can't be, it also creates, right? There's, at every level, it just creates. It creates infinitely. What it creates, time, space. Yeah. When God is operating in this mode, is what I mean by it. Yeah.
It can't be the right word.
Why?
It's the only right word.
Because
I'm not talking about God himself, because God himself is not defined by a trait, but I'm not talking about something that's separate from God either, because God forbid to say the divine traits are a creation. So you tell me what word I should use. In other words, it's not God, it's not him. Obviously, he does create, he acts through his traits, but his trait is not him, and we're discussing the difference between two divine traits. So when I say it, I mean the divine trait of kindness, Havaya. When God is acting through this trait, he creates in a way that what is created is not important. It is a self-expression way of creation, pure expression of self. So when I say it, I'm referring to the mode in which he does this.
I would, candidly,
Yeah.
I would prefer, it's hard to follow when you say it.
I'm sorry.
He said the mode of God creates.
Yeah.
And then I have an inkling.
Right.
You say it creates.
Shame.
Then it's too amorphous.
The name
I
of
think, or the name of God creates.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. So the name of God, it creates.
Correct. In this way, that what is created is not important. Conversely, Malchus, the other divine name, the name of Adonai, right, which starts with an Aleph, the lower divine name, which refers to his kingship, when it creates, even though it is above time and space itself, being a divine trait, when it creates in a way that it needs time and space, right? We said this last week in different words. When it creates in a way that what it creates is relevant. Just like the king, the nature of his nation matters to a king, just like the person listening to me matters when I speak, so too, when his kingship creates, time and space are important to it. So in other words,
So it needs earth or this world.
exactly, it needs the thing.
Without the world, it's nothing.
It needs the thing that is created, yes. So, therefore, they are both in some sense above the world. In other words, God's trait of kingship is obviously not, as one of the divine traits, something that is within the universe, God forbid. And both of them create the world, right? Even his name Havaya, which is transcendent, which we're saying is the higher name that has nothing to do with the world, even that name also is involved in the creation of the world. It's the divine kindness, right? In other words, when the bottom line is I'm trying to introduce some subtlety to our thinking. When we're going to be talking about the higher name, we're talking about unities, right? There's a higher thing and a lower thing that come together. The higher level unity is when the lower thing moves, right? Because it moves to the higher, so it's the higher level unity. Where does the unity take place? In the place of the higher thing.
Ascends.
Yeah, it ascends, exactly. The higher level unity is a motion of ascent. Then there is a lower level unity which takes place in the place of the lower thing, which is a descent. The higher thing comes lower, right? But in both of these unities, we have a higher thing and a lower thing. We have a name of Havaya, a divine name referring to his kindness, his transcendence of the universe. And we have the name Adonai, which refers to his kingship, his need for the universe, right? His direct involvement with the universe in a way that the universe is important, right? Both of these things that are coming together are involved in the creation. Neither of them is defined entirely by the world. In other words, it's subtle. They're different in the details, not in the essential natures of the thing, to put it in a different way. Both of these are spheres, is another way of putting it. Both of these are two of the 10 divine traits by which it creates the universe. So therefore, they're both divine, and they both are used to create the universe. If they're both divine traits used to create the universe. They're both divine. Neither one of them is of the universe. And both of them are used to create the universe. The difference is that even though the higher trait, even though Shem Havaya, even though the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God that we commonly use, is beyond time and space, even though it creates time and space, it is totally beyond them. Time and space do not matter to Shem Havaya, right? They're not relevant there. And so to Adonai, conversely, even though it is divine, nevertheless, the world matters there. You understand?
What created what's it?
Adonai, yeah, what about it?
Shem Havaya create Adonai?
No, let's say, in some sense maybe, but that's way beyond our pay grade. Let's say that these are two things which are of equal level, emanated from God. They're two modes of divine action. One does not create the other. They are independent, parallel, so to speak. Yes? So is anyone following what I'm saying? So there's the difference between them is whether the world matters, not in their essential position, which is divine, and not in their essential action, which is the creating of the world. They are both divine, they both create, but to one of them, the act of creation is an act of closeness. It's an act of, I care about the world and am involved in the world. One of them, the act of creation, is an act of distance. I just create, and whatever is created doesn't matter. That's the difference between the two. Okay? These are the two things that are going to be united in the two unities.
It seems like you're describing the difference between the universe and reality as we know it.
No, but that's not what I'm discussing. That's the whole point. The whole point is that this is at the next higher level. In other words, the lower thing here is reality, is the truth of the universe. That's the lower thing here. The lowest thing here, in the two things that are coming together, the Shem of Malchus, the name of kingship, that is the true nature of the universe. The true nature of the universe is that it is only the divine speech, the same as the divine kingship, which is the lower level thing we're discussing. That is the divine expression where the universe matters and is important. What it is going to unite with is something even higher, which is a level at which the universe does not matter and has no importance. It has no importance and relevance to its creator. These are the two things that are uniting. The truth of the world is uniting with something that is higher than the world, to put it in more simple terms. So, what are these two things? Is really what the Alter Rebbe is explaining. We'll watch. What the Alter Rebbe is explaining is, so let's go back. Let's read the bottom of 914. We say, Havaya indicates, right? The unity of these two things is a shiluv, is an integration of the two names Havaya and Adonai. What are these two things? Havaya indicates that he transcends time. It is the divine mode, the divine expression in which he is beyond time. And as we read at the bottom of the page, he also transcends space. Time and space are created from him. So my whole explanation that I just gave, which may have been a confusing explanation, was to explain how he creates time and space with Havaya, which is true, but that doesn't mean they're important to Havaya. Havaya is beyond time and space, even though it creates time and space. It's a mode of creation. It's a way of creation in which he is not involved. He is not invested, so to speak, if that's a better word. He is not invested in the outcome. Right? He creates, but in a way that he doesn't care, which may seem like a strange idea, and we're going to talk about it more. Okay? That's Havaya. That's the higher thing that we're unifying with. This is the nature of all of the higher 9 spheres than Malchus. 9 out of 10 of the divine traits, that's their approach. They create, but what is created is not relevant, is not important, is not material. Malchus is the opposite. Malchus, Shem Adonai, is where the world matters because he needs it to rule over it. Yes? Clear. I hope that's somewhat clear. Their space and time matter, right? Unlike Shem Havaya. It creates space and time, but because they matter, not just because it's a creator. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. Is everyone more or less with me? Roughly with me? Okay. Page 915. One second. One second, pardon me. Okay, v'hine, and let's just read further, and we're going to go back and explain. Afal pi shehu yisbarich l'mayla me'makam v'azman. Then there's a second point. The first point was that Malchus, God's kingship, is totally nullified like a ray of the sun in the sun. It's totally united with what's higher than it, right? Here's a second point. That was the higher level unity that we already mentioned. Now we have, even though he may be blessed, is higher than time and space, he is nevertheless found also below within time and space. Even though he is above time and space, he is also found below within time and space. Dahainu, meaning that he is united with his trait of Malchus, with his kingship, from which is drawn and created space and time. This is the lower level unity. So we have described the two unities. The two unities are as follows. The two ways that things come together are as follows. Either God's trait of kingship ascends and becomes one with what's above it, which is this name of Havaya, right? Or the name of Havaya comes down and unifies with what's below it, which is his Malchus, right? Or to put it in the language of the Alter Rebbe in a very poetic way, right? Either his kingship is united with him, or he is united with his kingship, right? In other words, two sides to the same coin. We're describing two ways, two relationships between his kingship and him. The two ways they are united. Either his kingship is united with him, in other words, his kingship ascends to its source, ascends to what's higher than it in godliness, or he is united with his kingship that he descends and is involved even with being a king. And the way these things are united is going to answer our question about how can it be that the universe matters to his kingship, because in both of these things, we're going to see that his kingship itself is nullified. His kingship itself is nothing. Either way you look at it. That's what we're going to explain. Let me just talk about these outside, and then next week we'll go back inside, God willing. For the last 10 minutes, let me lay the groundwork for a discussion of the higher level unity and the lower level unity in more detail. The higher level unity, it says in Chassidus, where his kingship ascends to be united with the godliness that is above it, where Adonai is within Havaya, right, the higher one on the whiteboard. This higher level unity is something that it says in Chassidus will only truly be experienced when Mashiach comes. That we will only experience truly when Mashiach comes. However, there have been tastes of it within history. One taste of the higher level unity was in the Beis HaMikdash. In fact, in the famous case that we've discussed on many occasions in this class of the Aron not taking up any space, right? In the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to remind everyone, in the Holy of Holies, there was the Aron and it sat in the middle of the room. And if you measured the ark, the Aron, it took up a certain amount of space. And if you measured the room, it took up a certain amount of space. But if you measured from the sides of the Aron to the walls, you would see that it equaled the entire length of the room. In other words, the Aron would both take up and not take up space in the Beis HaMikdash, right? We've discussed this miracle, so to speak, many times in this class. Why is this a taste of the higher level unity? We can now understand it. We can now understand this miracle in a deeper way based on what we've learned. The higher level unity, again, remember, is his kingship ascending to become one with godliness which is higher than it. What are the traits of his kingship? Well, his kingship is what creates the universe, and every universe must have time and space. Space is fundamental to the definition of a universe. That things take up the space they take up, right, is fundamental to the creation of a universe. That is a trait of Malchus, of the divine kingship, of this lower trait to which the universe matters. Time and space matter to his kingship. He needs them in order to be a king, because he needs a universe which is separate from him. And what is the most basic thing that makes a universe separate from him is time and space. Time and space are important to his kingship, his trait of malchus. But if this trait ascends and becomes nullified and becomes one, what would you see? You would see that even though there is space, what is space? Space is non-space. Space is nullified within a higher truth. Space is not a fixed rule, right? Space exists only to express godliness. It itself has no inherent importance. It doesn't matter.
Is the word
Right.
really assimilated or nullified?
What's the difference?
What is the difference?
What
When
is
you
the
null-
di-
when
what-
you
I'm asking-
nullify
yeah.
something, you negate it.
Right, it's not there.
Okay. When you assimilate something,
Yeah,
it becomes part of the fabric.
right. So it's either nullified within or it's assimilated. I think it's saying similar things, if I'm not mistaken. But let's say nullified. Let's be absolute. Let's say it's nullified. Space is nullified within the higher truth. And this is what you would see in the Holy of Holies in the Beis HaMikdash. You wouldn't see no space, right? It's not that space ceases to exist in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the Holy of Holies. What would you see? You would see there is space. There is measurable space, right? I can measure this box. I can measure this room. Space exists.
Measurement in there.
Pardon me?
It has a different measurement.
It has a different measurement, which is a different way of saying that space is not space. In other words, space is just a means by which God expresses himself, right? Remember what we said about the sun. Exactly. The divine, in other words, like we said before, remember, what did we say about the higher divine truth? About Shem Havaya, the higher mode of godly expression. What did we say about it?
It has no,
It doesn't care about how it's expressed, right? In other words, just like the sun doesn't care whether it falls in a palace or in a landfill, right? So too does this higher divine expression. It creates a world, but how does it create it? In a way that the world has no importance in itself, right? This is what you would see or experience if you could see this phenomenon of the space of the aura not taking up a measure. Right? Of the space of the ark not having a set space. What you would experience is that space itself, right, is only a happenstance creation of God's act of creation. It itself doesn't matter. The rules do not actually pertain. What appears to us as a set rule that defines the universe, that space is a defined quantity, a defined and measurable quantity, was revealed in the Kodesh HaKadoshim to be that it's not so. There is space, but what is the space? The space is only an expression of godliness. It's not space itself, if you understand what I'm saying. There's still something you can measure, which is called space, but what is the experience of that space? The experience is pure divine expression. There's no rules.
how
There's
can you
no...
call it space then?
Because, as the Rebbe explains, the only reason the miracle takes place is that it does take up a certain amount of space. Right? In other words, it must be that there is space. First of all, it's measurable. The whole miracle is determined through measure. Right? That itself indicates there's space. But even furthermore, the reason why it's considered the aron, the reason why it's considered the ark, such that the miracle happens to it, is because it's a box with a certain measure, as the Rebbe explains. In other words, the only reason this phenomenon is taking place is because there is space. Right?
And it's specific measurement.
Correct. Specific measurements of a specific measure. It's because it has the specific measure that it doesn't measure anything. That's the whole point, right? So that is Yichud Ilah. That is the higher level unity. The divine mode which values time and space is present, right? In other words, what's the depth here? The depth here is that it's not Havaya or Malchus. It's both together. Right? It's not Havaya or Adnai, pardon me. It's both together. It's a shiluv. It's an integration. If the Holy of Holies was created only with the divine name, which doesn't care about time and space at all, there would be no space, right? There would be no measurement. There would be no thing, right? Ray of the sun in the sun. There's nothing here,
Integration.
right? On the other hand, that would be a true nullification, not just a nullification in something else. That would be there would be no thing here that has the name at all, right? If only Malchus created it, right? If it was only a place of the expression of God's kingship, it would be like the regular laws of nature, where space behaves itself, and it's regular space, which is measurable and has a definition, right? What happened in the Holy of Holies was a yichuda, an integration, a unity, right? The two things coming together. There is space, but what do you hear is the whole message of space is that there is something beyond space, to which space is not relevant. That's the entire feeling. That's what you would perceive. That's what is expressed in the space in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. In other words, that's what space becomes. His trait of kingship becomes totally one. It ascends and becomes one with his higher trait, where the world, the time and space are of no importance. That's the higher level unity. And you also see it in time. The Rebbe Rashab writes in one of his discourses, in time, the example of this is with Adam HaRishon, the first man, who the first man, Adam, was shown all the generations that would follow after him. It said he was shown in a moment, in a very short amount of time, he was shown all of the generations that would come from him. In other words, he saw everything that would happen, right, from his until the end of time in his descendants, right? So it was the same idea. Time existed. This was a vision which happened within time. But what was time expressing? Time was expressing the beyond time. The way in which time does not have any achiza. It has no, what's the word? It has no hold. It has no control. That's what the higher level unity is like. I want to give the example this week because I think the examples will help guide a lot when we get more into the weeds and the more technical things. These examples will be very useful. So the taste of...
Did you say more technical?
Yeah. Well, like we said, like we did today, like I did earlier. So in other words, this is the simplification. So the higher level unity, that's an example of the higher level unity, is that you have time, but in time you feel the beyond time. That's the higher level unity. The lower level unity, Yehuda Tata, is the opposite. You have the higher than time, but all that's felt is time. You have the higher, but all that's felt is time. As we will explain more about both of these unities. The Rebbe I'll finish with, the Rebbe has a beautiful teaching where he explains in Avodah, in the service of God, what it means to live at all of these levels, right? He says, if you serve God in the way of the world, of just Malchus, just shame, no, pardon me. The world is Adonai creates it. In other words, neither of the divine names, just the world, right? In other words, not the trait of divine speech, but the actual words which are spoken, right? Which is what the world is just the divine speech. What is that service of God? That service of God is like someone who I serve the king, but I am a separate existence from the king. In other words, that's like a paid worker, for example. Right? In other words, I have my own life, right? The Rebbe in a different place gives an example. He explains the difference between, in a Chassidic metaphor, he explains the difference between the owner of a business and the worker at a business, right? The difference between the owner of the business and the worker of the business is that the worker of the business is not up at 3 a.m. sweeping the floors, right? That's basically the difference. The owner of the business, this is my life, this belongs to me, I'm totally united with this whole affair, right? The worker at the business, I work on a time schedule. When my time at the business is over, I go home and the whole business could burn down. It doesn't matter to me, except I would need a new job, maybe, right? That's the difference. So a person who serves God as simply a creature of the world, right, serves God in this way, where I serve God, but I have my life and he has his life. Right? He has his thing and he does his thing and I do my thing. But in my thing, I make an allowance for him, right? He's important. I'll set aside some time of the day, right? Like a worker, I'll set aside some time of the day where I care about what he wants. Yeah, that's a person who serves as within the world, because the world is a separate existence from God and its own self-perception, right? Then you have a person who serves God in a way of Adonai, right, in a way of this lower level name of Hashem, which this person, his whole identity is that he is nothing, but he is a nothing which is important to God. right? Just like the world, right, to Adonai is nothing. It is nothing. The world is nothing other than the divine speech, right? The world is nothing. All there is the divine speech. But in what way is it nothing? It's a nothing that matters, right? You say, I'm nothing, but in a way that I matter to God. Serving God in a way of Havaya, serving God in a way of this higher name, right, is to serve Him in a way that all that is here is God. Right? I have no existence of myself. And what is the yichud? The yichud is when those two last levels come together. It's that really a Jew in his life has to have both. He has to have both. He has to have a yichud. You can't just be, I don't exist at all. Right? That's not what God wants of us. God creates us to exist in this world and work within this world. But you also can't be just, I'm nothing, but I'm a nothing that matters. A Jew has to have both. He has to have both of these things coming together. He has to matter, and he has to also not matter. It's the tension. It's the whole tension. The whole tension is does the world and what I do matter to God, or does it not matter? And the answer is both. It's a yichud, which you have to put both together. It has to matter and not matter. Now, there's two different ways to look at that. There's one way to look at it where not mattering is what's dominant. That's the primary way of serving God. That's yichud ilah, the higher level unity. And then there's I matter is the main thing, is the lower level unity. But a complete Jewish life, it'll have different measures of both, sometimes more of one, sometimes more of the other, but a complete Jewish life always has both. A complete Jewish life, right, as the famous story goes, that there was a famous Jew, a great rabbi, who used to walk around with two pieces of paper, one in each pocket, right? One said, for me the world was created, and the other piece of paper said, I am but dust and ashes, right? The Jew lives in this tension, where on the one hand what we do is very important, and it's very important that it be very important to us. On the other hand, there is this idea of not being important, of not existing. There's a famous Chassidic story, which is you probably wouldn't have heard because it's not one of the, this is a olden but golden yeshiva classic, not a Chabad house, not often brought out in the Chabad house, perhaps for reasons that will become clear. It's not the most pleasant thing ever, but I think it illustrates a very important point, right? Of what's the difference between the bittul of Adonai and the bittul of Havaya. What's the difference between being a nothing that matters and a nothing that doesn't matter, right? And the Chassidim, to illustrate this point, used to tell this story. And the story is that when the Tsar used to, right, the Tsar, kingship, right? When the Tsar used to want to cross broad rivers, I don't know if this is true, this is the Chassidic story, it's a metaphor. When the Tsar wanted to cross broad rivers in Russia, and they would have no bridge building equipment, they would have no means by which to get the army across, and they needed to get the army across quickly to go fight some threat, what the Tsar would do is he would slowly march his soldiers into the river. And the soldiers would go into the river, and some of them would die and wash away, but some of them would get stuck in the mud. And then he would march in more soldiers on top of them, and some of those would drown. And he would march in more and more and more soldiers until the river would be basically dammed with their bodies, and then they would march across the river. That's the metaphor.
That's also recent Soviet military strategy.
Also true, right? Didn't die with the Tsar. So what's the difference between serving in a way of Adonai and serving in the name of Havaya, right? Remember, the lower one is that I am nothing, but the nothing matters. The higher one is that there is nothing here other than God, right? In this situation, the lower level is I am nothing, but the nothing matters. Is that first the lowest level is of the world, which is the soldier who says, "You're crazy. I have my own life. I'm not giving my life just so the Tsar can cross the river," and he deserts. That's the regular soldier, right? Then you have the soldier who serves the Tsar in a way of Adonai. I'm a nothing, but the nothing matters. That soldier makes sure that he's back somewhere in the middle of the ranks of the soldiers, so that when he drowns, he'll be somewhere on the outside, and the Tsar will see his face. Right? The Tsar will see him. At least when the Tsar is crossing the riverbank, he'll see my body, and he'll know that I died serving him. That's the bittul of Adonai. That's the bittul of I'm a nothing, but the nothing matters, right? The bittul of Havaya right? The bittul of Havaya, which is felt in the higher level unity, right? Which is felt in was felt in the Kodesh Kodashim, is that it doesn't matter if I'm the first soldier into the river and I die in the underneath and everyone forgot I ever existed. That's the higher level. That's the bittul of Havaya. The bittul of Havaya is not only am I nothing, not only do I not have my own life, but I don't matter. Right? I'm not of relevance. I'm a nothing, but not in a way that the king should notice I'm nothing and give my family a stipend, right? I'm a nothing in a way that it doesn't even matter to me if the king doesn't notice.
Both ביטול היש, none of them is ביטול במציאות.
Bitul Messias doesn't exist in Alam Hazeh. At least not without the help of the Nefesh Elokis anyway. He's saying none of these are really losing one's very existence. Bittul b'metzias and bittul hayesh, two different types of nullifications. The higher level nullification is to lose one's very existence. The lower is simply to lose one's sense of independence, that I realize that I'm dependent on something. So Rani is saying that neither of these is really losing their very existence, right? Both of them have sworn fealty to the Tsar, but they still exist as a separate person. Rani is complaining. But the truth is that in this world anyway, you wouldn't find a relationship between a soldier and a czar. There's actually bittul b'metzias, where the person loses their own existence entirely, right? Death is pretty much as close as we can describe in a physical relationship like that. It's only with the Nefesh Elokis, only with the divine soul, that such a relationship is possible in this world, very likely. But in any case, the point is that there's being nothing and it matters, and there's being nothing and it doesn't matter. And the Jewish life, again, has both. It's not neither one of the extremes. It has both. And the way that the two, in what measure, there's two different ways. There's a higher level unity where I feel that the nothing doesn't matter, and a lower level unity where the nothing does matter. Right? So the first 6 chapters of this part of Tanya were to explain to you that you're nothing. Right? All there is here is the divine speech. You don't exist apart from the divine speech at all. Chapter 7 is dealing with the question of, okay, I'm nothing, but do I matter? Right? I'm nothing, but is this a nothing that God needs or nothing that God doesn't need? And the answer is both. Both are true. It's a unity. It's a unity between these two ideas. And there's a higher level unity, which is more that you don't matter, and a lower level unity, which is more that you do matter. As we'll discuss more next week, God willing.